Grant Miller had always been a quiet man. Not withdrawn or antisocial, just intentional. After 2 decades of working as a software systems engineer in Dallas, he retired early, bought a modest home on the outskirts of Greenfield Meadows, and settled into a lifestyle that suited him. Fishing at dawn, reading on the porch, and tinkering with old radios in his garage. His home wasn't flashy, but it was his. He kept the grass cut, painted the trim every few years, and didn't bother anyone, and he wasn't part of the HOA. That distinction had been made clear when he purchased the property. His house sat just outside the official HOA boundary line, grandfathered in, per county records. It was even detailed in the purchase contract and confirmed in the county's plat map. Grant didn't owe dues, didn't answer to neighborhood codes, and didn't receive newsletters telling him what shade of beige was acceptable for his mailbox. It was one of the many reasons he'd chosen that house. He hadn't anticipated Karen Winslow. Karen was the type of HOA president who treated the title like a badge of moral superiority. She was in her early 50s, dressed like a school principal on inspection day, and had the unnerving habit of walking around the neighborhood clipboard first. Under her leadership, the HOA had grown increasingly militant, issuing citations for things like excessively decorative flower pots and non-regulation patio furniture. She ruled through passive-aggressive emails, whispered threats, and the fine print of neighborhood covenants few had ever read. At first, she ignored Grant. His house wasn't under her thumb, after all. But then came the chicken coop. It was a small structure, more of a shed than a coop, painted the same color as his house, and carefully tucked behind a wooden privacy fence. Grant had built it over the course of 3 weekends, not because he wanted to start a farm, but because he enjoyed the challenge. When the hens arrived, quiet, plump, and content, the only ones who seemed to notice were the neighborhood kids, who occasionally wandered over to peek through the fence and giggle, but Karen noticed too. And she did not approve. She showed up unannounced on a Wednesday morning, clipboard in hand, lips pursed. Grant was pulling weeds in the front yard when she stepped onto his lawn without asking. "Mr. Miller," she said in a tone that suggested trouble. "You're in violation of Greenfield Meadows Ordinance 14D. Livestock is prohibited." Grant stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I'm not in the HOA." She blinked, as if she hadn't considered the possibility, then smiled, tightly. "All residents are subject to community standards." He shook his head. "Not legally, no. My property predates the HOA's formation. You'll find that in the public record." Karen stared at him for a moment, then jotted something on her clipboard and walked away without another word. Over the following weeks, Grant received no fewer than 6 letters, each one more insistent than the last. They came on HOA letterhead, signed by Karen, and included fabricated citations, threats of escalating fines, and mandatory compliance assessments. Grant ignored them at first. Then he responded with a copy of his deed, his exemption documentation, and a polite note asking for no further contact. But Karen wasn't interested in legality. She was interested in obedience. Then came the day she let herself in. Grant was upstairs sorting through a box of old vinyl records when he heard the front door creak open. Not knock, open. By the time he made it down the stairs, Karen was in his kitchen, snooping through a drawer. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" he demanded. Karen didn't flinch. "I'm conducting an HOA inspection. Your property is being reassessed. You broke into my home. It's within our authority to enter non-compliant residences for inspection." She snapped, her tone clipped and officious. "No, it's not. Not here. Not ever." Karen reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notebook, flipping to a page marked with yellow tabs. "It clearly states." Grant walked to the door, calmly locked it, and pulled his phone from his pocket. "You're not leaving until the police arrive," he said. "You can't do that," she hissed. "You trespassed. You broke in. You are right now committing a crime." He hit record on his phone and set it on the counter. The camera captured everything, her denials, her confusion, and the moment she realized he wasn't going to let her bluff her way out of this. When the sheriff arrived 15 minutes later, Grant opened the door and waved him in. Sheriff Calloway was a seasoned man, slow-talking but sharp-eyed. He listened carefully, examined the documentation Grant presented, and shook his head. "Karen," he said flatly, "you have no jurisdiction over this property." Karen began to argue, gesturing wildly toward the neighborhood, insisting that the HOA had granted her rights to enforce community standards. "Maybe over your members," Calloway said, crossing his arms. "But not over Grant. And definitely not inside his house." She was arrested on the spot. Trespassing, breaking and entering, unlawful harassment. Grant handed over the video footage and printed copies of his property deed. The case was open and shut. What came next was both gratifying and surreal. Karen pled not guilty. Her lawyer tried to argue that she'd misunderstood her authority, that the HOA's evolving charter had led to reasonable confusion. But the judge wasn't having it. The video was clear. The evidence overwhelming. Karen was convicted. The sentence was light, probation, a fine, and a restraining order, but the public disgrace was enormous. She was removed from the HOA board in a special vote, losing not only her position, but also her influence. The neighborhood shifted almost overnight. Grant wasn't the type of man who celebrated in public. He didn't post about the arrest. He didn't gloat. He didn't stand in the middle of the street shouting, "I told you so." But when the news of Karen's conviction spread, neighbors he hardly knew began stopping by, some out of curiosity, others with cautious gratitude. A man from 3 streets over left a homemade pie on Grant's porch with a sticky note that said, "Thank you for standing up when the rest of us were too afraid." A young mother who had once been fined for letting her kids use chalk on the sidewalk walked her children by Grant's house just to point and say, "That's the man who stopped her." Within a week, the neighborhood's climate shifted. Not drastically, but enough. The HOA board, now minus its iron-fisted president, started holding open meetings. Fewer violation notices were issued. A community input email address was created, and for the first time in years, someone actually answered it. Fines were reviewed. In some cases, refunded. The strangled atmosphere of constant surveillance started to loosen. And no one asked Grant to lead anything. And he wouldn't have anyway. But his house had become something else now, a kind of landmark. Not flashy, not loud. Just solid. Like him. He added a few features to the property, most of them symbolic. The kitchen window Karen had stood in front of, caught on camera trying to justify her illegal inspection, was reinforced with shatterproof glass. Not because he expected another break-in, but because it felt right. Next to it, just inside, he mounted a small wooden plaque he carved himself. It read, "This is not your house." Simple. Direct. A reminder, but it was the front door that got the most attention. After the trial, Grant had replaced his welcome mat. The new one was custom ordered. In bold white letters across black rubber it read, "Not in the HOA. Not interested." Visitors laughed. A few took pictures. A neighbor asked if she could order one just like it. Soon, 3 or 4 more appeared on other doorsteps around Greenfield Meadows, subtle signals of solidarity. Not anti-community. Just pro-boundaries. Some residents struggled with the change. A few of Karen's old allies tried to float the idea of reinstating stricter enforcement. One even suggested that Karen's actions, while excessive, had been rooted in a desire for neighborhood pride. But the board had changed. The new leadership, elected quietly, almost sheepishly, understood the temperature had shifted. The community didn't want control. It wanted respect. Grant kept to himself mostly, but his actions spoke for him. He hosted a small gathering in late fall, not a protest, not a celebration. Just coffee and lawn chairs under the oak tree out back. He invited a handful of neighbors, most of whom had been quiet observers during the ordeal. They brought muffins, cider, and folding tables. Someone brought a Bluetooth speaker. For 3 hours, people who had once feared citation for overgrown shrubs or wind chimes too loud simply talked and laughed and remembered what it felt like to live in a neighborhood, not under a regime. A new rule was quietly passed by the HOA a few weeks later. No member could enter another resident's property without consent or legal justification. It wasn't just a policy, it was a correction. A formal acknowledgement that the line between governance and violation had been crossed. Grant never showed up to speak at the meetings. But his name was in every conversation. Not because he wanted it to be, but because he had become proof that when someone crosses the line, the quiet neighbor with a chicken coop and a camera might be the one who restores balance. The court's restraining order kept Karen away. Her house went up for sale the following spring. It sat on the market for 5 months, overpriced and overgrown, until it finally sold well below asking. The buyer, unaware of the local drama, tore out the rose bushes and planted tomatoes. No one complained. Grant's life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such an upheaval. He still woke early. Still worked on his projects. The chicken still clucked quietly behind the fence. But something inside him had shifted, not hardened, not bitter, just clearer. He knew now that the law wasn't just something written in books or posted on signs. It was a boundary made real when someone cared enough to defend it, and others saw that too. Spring came early to Greenfield Meadows the following year. The trees bloomed fast, and the air felt a little lighter than it had in seasons past. Some said it was just the weather, others joked it was the first spring in 10 years without a single threat of seasonal yard noncompliance. Whatever the reason, the neighborhood felt different, but not loud. Not radical. Just steady. Grant didn't change much about his routines. He still walked to the mailbox in the same navy windbreaker, still nodded at neighbors with a slow, polite smile. He had never chased attention, and even now that his name carried weight beyond his own street, he avoided anything that resembled praise. But people knew. And more than a few began to follow his example in their own quiet ways. A young family 2 houses over built a playhouse in their backyard, technically a few inches taller than the previous HOA height limit. No one said a word. An elderly couple down the street painted their fence blue. Bright, unapologetic blue. Again, no complaints. People started to plant what they wanted. Sit outside longer. Speak a little more freely at HOA meetings, asking questions where once they'd only nodded, and the meetings themselves felt different. Less about what was forbidden, and more about what was possible. The new board, 3 neighbors who'd never imagined themselves in leadership, focused on pothole repairs, volunteer garden days, and coordinating a town hall with the county for better broadband access. The vibe was practical, grounded, and refreshingly boring. Exactly what people wanted. As for Karen Winslow, she never returned. Her name was rarely spoken, and when it was as a cautionary tale. Not in cruelty, but with clarity. A reminder of what happens when someone confuses leadership with dominion. Her rule had left scars, but also a roadmap. One man, a handful of documents, and a calm decision not to be intimidated had unraveled her illusion of control. One afternoon in early June, a reporter from a regional magazine stopped by Grant's house, asking for a feature story on local heroes standing up to abusive HOAs. Grant declined the interview. He told her, "I'm not a story. I'm just someone who said no when it mattered." She published the piece anyway, with his name omitted, by request. But everyone in Greenfield Meadows recognized the description. The plaque inside Grant's kitchen stayed up. So did the reinforced window, and the cheeky welcome mat, which by now had inspired dozens of others in the neighborhood. Some were printed. Others hand-painted. They weren't about rebellion. They were about identity. A neighborhood of people who now understood what their lines were, and how to hold them with dignity. On the 1-year anniversary of Karen's arrest, a few of the newer residents organized a neighborhood brunch. Not in protest, not as celebration, but as acknowledgement. They didn't ask Grant to speak. They didn't need to. But they presented him with a gift anyway. A small wooden sign for his chicken coop, laser-etched with the words, "Cooped up but never back down." He laughed when he read it. Not a big laugh, just that quiet, knowing kind that lingers in the back of the throat. He thanked them, and hung it proudly on the coop gate. That evening, he sat on his porch with a book, the light fading slow across the yard, a cold drink sweating in his hand. The sounds of kids on scooters, someone hammering a fence post, distant music playing from an open window, all signs of a place that had, against the odds, found its way back to being a community. and Grant felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. Not relief. Not victory. Just peace. He didn't win by yelling. He didn't win by fighting dirty. He won by being prepared, by knowing the law, and by standing still when someone tried to push him. That kind of stillness carried power, not the kind that dominates, but the kind that endures. In a world where people are often taught to avoid trouble at all costs, to give in for the sake of convenience, to let someone else speak up, Grant had simply refused to be erased, and that was enough. In the quiet just before dusk, he leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and smiled. He was home, and now, finally. Everyone knew it.